April 2024 has arguably been one of the most challenging months for Ukraine since the start of the invasion. Russia is making almost daily gains in Donbass, which has not been the case since the first months of the war. Ukraine is struggling due to a manpower disadvantage caused by delays in the adoption of the new mobilization bill. Due to the delays in American aid, Russia has been enjoying a massive firepower advantage in recent months as well. However, the only really good news for Ukraine is that the United States has finally approved the Ukraine aid bill, which will help Kyiv mitigate the latter issue. Welcome to our update on the war in Ukraine. Fans of modern warfare would surely enjoy our series on the World War II North African campaign and Pacific War, available exclusively to our YouTube members and patrons via the links in the description and pinned comment. Join their ranks and watch the series on the Albigensian Crusade, Fall of Sparta, First Punic War, Italian Reunification Wars, History of Prussia, Biography of Sulla, Russo-Japanese War, Reconquista, Persian Wars and War of Spanish Succession, and much more. Thanks for supporting us. In April, Russia continued putting immense pressure on Ukrainian lines in the Donetsk Oblast. One of their main focuses is Chasiv Yar, a town west of Bakhmut, which has major strategic significance. We have dedicated a separate video to the Battle of Chasiv Yar, so you can go ahead and check it out to understand why this battle is so important. But just to reiterate, after capturing Avdiivka and advancing west of Ivanivska, the Russian army approached Chasiv Yar in April. Military analysts expect the Russians to conduct their offensive in a manner similar to the battle in Bakhmut. They will attempt to attack from the north and the south to cut some of the supply lines into the town, along with launching a frontal assault. The challenge for the Russian army is that Chasiv Yar lies on elevation, which gives the Ukrainians a defensive advantage. The town is also protected by a canal in its east, but according to several sources, the Russians managed to cross it on April 30th. If that is true, it means that the Russian army is now one step closer to victory in this battle. The capture of Chasiv Yar would give the Russian army a great launching pad for further offensive operations on the remaining fortress cities of Donbass, Konstantinivka, Druzhkivka, and eventually Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. The deputy chief of the Ukrainian military intelligence, Skibitsky, gave a rather sobering assessment of Ukraine's situation in Chasiv Yar, stating in an interview to The Economist that it is probably a matter of time before this town falls. Russia also achieved an important advance west of Avdiivka. After losing Avdiivka, the Ukrainian army managed to stabilize the situation initially, but in April, the Russians managed a breakthrough in this sector. It is reported that on April 22nd, the 47th Mechanized Brigade was pulling back from the frontline village of Ocheretina to be substituted by the 115th Mechanized Brigade. But an error in the timing of the rotation or the collapse of the 115th Brigade enabled the 30th and the 27th Russian brigades to swiftly capture most of Ocheretina. The Russians took advantage of this breakthrough and within a week captured Novobakhmutivka, Bedichi, Semenivka, Novokalinova and Keramik, along with occupying Novomikhailovka and entering Netailova and Krasnohorivka further south. According to analyst Konrad Muzika, the Russians have brought around 20 new units to the Donetsk Oblast to take advantage of this success. The only consolation for Ukraine is that the Russians did not attempt a truly mechanized breakthrough to capitalize on disarray in the Ukrainian lines around Ocheretina. The conventional military wisdom says that if you create a wedge in the enemy's defenses, you should send in tanks to push forward to the rear of the enemy, forcing the enemy lines to collapse. However, either due to the absence of truly mechanized forces or out of caution, the Russian command decided against doing this. They have instead chosen to progress slowly. What does this breakthrough mean? The primary goal of the Ocheretina axis of the Russian attack is Pokrovsk, a strategically important supply hub on the intersection of several highways. But Pokrovsk is more than 30 kilometers away from the front line, so barring a truly major collapse of the Ukrainian front on this axis, it is not a given that the Russians will reach this city. If the Russian pressure on Ukrainian defenses in this area becomes too unbearable, they will have to retreat to Progress, the nearest town with a known defensive line along the river Vovcha. The Russians are also pushing along the E50 highway and along the N15 highway to Kurahove, another important supply hub. The further the Russians advance, the further supply problems Ukrainian forces between those highways are going to have, forcing them to withdraw to avoid encirclement. So at this point, the Russians are putting immense pressure on the Ukrainian defenses on a broad front, from Chasiv Yar to Avdiivka. A Ukrainian collapse anywhere on this front might be disastrous for their defense of Donbass. Ukraine is facing arguably the most threatening situation on the battlefield since the early days of the war. The situation on other fronts in Ukraine has remained stable. Russia has seemingly given up on its attempts to advance on the North Luhansk front. After months of fighting, hundreds of pieces of destroyed equipment, and thousands of dead and injured, Russia failed to achieve any meaningful success in the Kupiansk axis. They have reportedly withdrawn some units from this area and have redeployed them to Belgorod Oblast, possibly in preparation for an attack on Kharkiv. Statements of Putin and the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov about the necessity to create a cordon sanitaire along the border with Ukraine in order to prevent Ukraine from shelling Russian territory, along with reports about the massing of forces in Belgorod, indicate that Russia may indeed attack Kharkiv. But even if they do not, these speculations force the Ukrainians to commit troops to the defense of Kharkiv. The Russians did the same thing earlier with Kyiv, prompting the Ukrainians to deploy more troops to their northern border. On the Zaporizhia front, Russia has not managed any meaningful gains in April, as battles are still going on in the same areas, Robotyne, Verbova and Urozhaina. Along the Dnipro, Ukraine still maintains a small bridgehead in Krinky, which has become a site of costly battles for both sides. So what has caused the Russian breakthrough in Donetsk Oblast? Military analysts point out three main reasons. First of all, manpower disadvantage. The Ukrainian commander, General Lieutenant Sodol, stated in the Ukrainian parliament that the Russians have a 7 to 10-fold manpower advantage in some areas of the battlefield. In some cases, a brigade has to defend a 15-kilometer line instead of a 5-kilometer line. This obviously puts a massive strain on Ukrainian forces and stretches them to their limits. But why has that happened? Why do the Ukrainians have fewer soldiers? Well, it is a self-inflicted problem to a large extent. The Ukrainian government has been trying to avoid making the unpopular decision of adopting a mobilization bill, and even after concluding that the only way of going forward is the draft of more Ukrainians into the army, the decision-making process has been very slow. The Ukrainian opposition in the parliament also campaigned against some provisions of the bill, further delaying the process. War, by definition, is full of unpopular decisions. In some cases, you cannot simply avoid them. If you intend to fight and give yourself a chance of success, you have to make these hard decisions, often having to choose between two or more evils, even if it harms your reputation and political career. After months of stalling and deliberation, on April 11th, the Ukrainian parliament finally adopted the mobilization bill, lowering the draft age from 27 to 25, which expanded the pool of available manpower for the Ukrainian army. Zelensky signed the bill on April 16th. Thousands of Ukrainians have fled the war to Poland and Lithuania, the governments of which have offered to repatriate Ukrainian men to make them available to be drafted into the Ukrainian army. Some decisions are being made, but it will take weeks or even months before existing Ukrainian brigades are replenished and new ones are created, so Ukraine may continue facing manpower shortages for the upcoming weeks at the very least. The second cause of Ukrainian troubles on the battlefield is pretty obvious and by now well documented too: the delay of American military aid. Europe has compensated for this delay to an extent, but its military-industrial capacity is just not big enough to supply the Ukrainian army on a sufficient level. There are significant shortages of artillery shells and air defense systems and missiles. According to the US-European Command, EUCOM, Commander General Christopher Cavoli, Russia currently has a 5-to-1 artillery advantage on the battlefield, and it could become a 10-to-1 advantage if the US fails to send shells to Ukraine. The lack of air defense systems forces the Ukrainian command to decide between protecting cities, energy infrastructure, industrial enterprises, and other key components of Ukrainian livelihood. The lack of mobile and short-range air defense systems closer to the contact line has allowed Russian fighters and bombers to roam the skies of the front lines like never before in this war. The lack of air defense missiles forces Ukraine to ration and prevents them from shooting down Russian missiles and drones. All of this continues having a very tangible impact on Ukraine's desperate attempts to defend. Zelensky insists that Ukraine needs 26 Patriot launchers to have air protection throughout the country. But it seems like the initial urgent goal is to get 7 Patriots as soon as possible. The foreign minister Kuleba's frustration with his Western counterparts was vivid during the meeting celebrating NATO's 75th anniversary. "I'm sorry to spoil the birthday party, but who can believe that the mightiest military alliance in the world cannot find 7 batteries of Patriots to provide them to the only country in the world that is fighting ballistic attacks every day?" He then added, "I feel myself hitting the wall with my own head, although I'm a diplomat, and that means I have to dismantle the wall brick by brick." So far, despite heavy diplomatic activity, only Germany pledged an additional Patriot system in April, along with promising more air defense missiles, while the Dutch Prime Minister Rutte offered to buy Patriot systems from countries which do not wish to give them to Kyiv directly. The German Diehl Defense Company has also pledged to send another Iris-T in the upcoming weeks. F-16s pledged by several allies have obviously not arrived in Ukraine yet, but they would help considerably in preventing Russian jets from operating freely on the front lines, along with shooting down Russian missiles. The timeline of arrival of promised F-16s is not clear yet, whether in order to take advantage of an element of surprise or due to some unknown logistical or training-related delays. The Dutch defense minister has said that the allies hope to deliver the jets in the summer, which Zelensky claims to cover only 10% of the number of jets that Ukraine needs. But the situation for Ukraine may change with the breakthrough in Washington. After months of delays and negotiations, the US Congress finally approved $61 billion of aid to Ukraine on April 21st. A few days later, the Senate did the same. $23 billion would be spent on restocking the US military, which would allow the Americans to send military equipment from the Pentagon's reserves. $14 billion will be allocated to the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, enabling the US military to purchase new weapons for Kyiv directly from US defense companies. $11 billion will be spent on funding the existing American military operations in the region and supporting Ukraine with intelligence. Finally, up to $8 billion will be given to Kyiv to help maintain government services, including the payment of salaries and pensions. Ukraine is relieved to finally get a decision they expected from Washington, but as you can see, not all of the money allocated by the Congress will actually be spent on Ukraine. Moreover, it will take weeks for the American aid to arrive, which are weeks that the Kremlin will look to exploit to push further. Many question whether this aid alone will be sufficient to even achieve firepower parity with the Russian army, or if the United States commits to further military aid in case the war goes on for even longer. For now, the US has already announced military aid packages which contain some of the immediate equipment that the Ukrainian army desperately needs. On April 24th, they pledged RIM-7 and AIM-9M air defense missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, and artillery shells of different kinds. The third cause of the recent Russian success is attributed to the poor defensive lines that the Ukrainian army has. In previous videos, we have talked about this issue in more detail, but just to reiterate the main problems that Ukraine faces in this regard, the construction of fortifications is often slow due to money and personnel shortages. Ukrainian soldiers are often forced to do the work under intense enemy fire. The Russians' glide bombs have so far proved to be very potent against Ukrainian fortifications. The Ukrainian defense continues to rely mostly on strongholds, which are vulnerable to flanking, and once a stronghold falls or is breached, there is often no alternative defense lines nearby to fall back to. Ukraine's summer 2023 counter-offensive has proven the advantage of continuous defensive lines, consisting of minefields, trenches, and fortifications against offensive operations. But what about the Russian army? Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines, and many military analysts, conclude that the Russian army has been learning from its mistakes and adapting to the situation way better than during the early disastrous months of the war. Obviously, the manpower advantage is also making a decisive difference at the moment. The Russian Ministry of Defense claims that 100,000 Russians have signed contracts to join the army in 2024. Rumors of further personnel mobilization in Russia continue to circulate. According to the EUCOM commander General Christopher Cavalli, the Russian invasion force has increased from 360,000 men to 470,000 in comparison with 2023. Bloomberg reported about the increase of one-time payments for contracts signed with the military to almost $5,000, which is a major sum for an ordinary Russian. This is accompanied by increased military production in Russia, which we have discussed in previous videos. In his interview with The Economist, Skibitsy noted that Russia's military production has increased, but will reach its full potential in 2026, which is a long time from now and will depend on the ability and willingness of Ukraine's Western allies to continue supporting Kyiv in the mid and long term. The war in Ukraine has made joining the military and the military-industrial complex attractive options for many Russians, particularly those suffering from lower standards of living. Along with the increased production, the Russians are also adapting their equipment to the challenges arising on the battlefield. According to reports, the effectiveness of Excalibur GPS-guided munitions has decreased from 70% early on in their use to a mere 6% due to the improvement of Russian electronic warfare tools. We have seen many videos of Russian armor being destroyed by FPV drones, and the Russians have been looking for solutions to protect them. Lately, they have been adding metal defensive covers on tanks and armored vehicles. They look amusing, but they actually manage to protect their vehicles to a certain extent. So the Russian army is adapting, but this does not mean that the Russian mobilized soldiers have suddenly started fighting better than the professional soldiers they had at the beginning of the war, or that Shoigu and other Russian generals have suddenly become better commanders and strategists. No, the key reason for the recent Russian success is the overwhelming manpower and firepower advantage arising from the reasons we have already discussed. We have already mentioned some information about foreign military aid to Ukraine delivered or pledged in April, the highlight of which is obviously the American decision that we talked about earlier. The first American military aid packages since the signing of the Ukraine aid bill included Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, MRAP vehicles, Humvees, TOW missiles, Javelin and AT-4 anti-tank guns, mines and other vital equipment, along with sending artillery shells and air defense missiles as earlier mentioned. But perhaps more importantly, the Russians have confirmed the delivery of an unspecified number of ATACMS missiles with a 300-kilometer range. Ukraine has already used them on high-value targets in April. The US has also announced the transfer of weapons seized from Iran, which consisted of small arms and bullets, along with approving the potential sale of equipment to modernize Kyiv's Hawk air defense systems. On April 26th, the Pentagon chief Lloyd Austin announced America's largest yet military aid package, which includes ammunition for Patriot, HIMARS and NASAMS, artillery shells, anti-drone equipment, and air-to-surface missiles. Lastly, the Americans have also reportedly purchased 81 outdated Su-24, MiG-29 and MiG-27 fighter jets from Kazakhstan, which are expected to be delivered to Ukraine for use as spare parts. On April 3rd, the Finnish President Stubb signed a 10-year security deal with Ukraine and pledged 188 million euros worth of military aid and an additional 290 million euros for humanitarian purposes. A day later, Latvia announced sending 1 million euros worth of drones and a 22.2 million euro military aid package. Latvia has also signed a security agreement with Ukraine, wherein Riga commits to sending 0.25% of its annual GDP to Ukraine. On April 6th, Latvia's Baltic neighbors stepped up too. Lithuania delivered an unspecified number of M577 armored personnel carriers, while Estonia's defense minister Pevkur announced their intention to coordinate the purchase of 1 million shells for the Ukrainian army. It is important to note that this initiative is separate from the similar Czech endeavor launched earlier. On April 9th, the German Rheinmetall Corporation announced the delivery of 20 more Marder infantry fighting vehicles, while the German government pledged to send 6,155mm artillery shells, small arms, and other equipment. Denmark also took several steps to improve the situation of the Ukrainian military. First, on April 16th, they announced a military aid package worth $313 million, while 3 days later, the Danish government allocated almost $30 million for purchase of military equipment produced in Ukraine by Ukrainian companies. The purpose was to aid both the Ukrainian army and its military-industrial production. According to the Ukrainian Minister of Strategic Industries, Kamyshin, the Ukrainian budget lags behind the country's capacity to produce military equipment, and Western allies may help to bridge this gap. Ukraine has been taking important steps in increasing domestic military production, focusing on production of drones, but they are stepping up in other areas too. According to Zelensky, for the first time, Ukraine has produced 10 Bodena self-propelled howitzers in a single month. On April 17th, Canada pledged to provide more than $1 billion worth of military aid over the next 5 years. On April 23rd, Britain announced a £500 million military aid package to Kyiv, its largest since the start of the war. It includes over 400 unspecified vehicles, ammunition, 60 boats, air defense equipment, Storm Shadow long-range missiles, and Paveway 4 laser-guided bombs compatible with F-16 jets. On April 26th, Norway announced funding for maintenance of Leopard tanks in Poland, while Australia declared a $100 million Australian military aid package, which includes drones, short-range air defense, precision munition, and so on. Meanwhile, China is reportedly becoming more and more supportive of Russia, despite its earlier attempts to appear neutral. The Chinese leader Xi Jinping has called on Europe to stop giving weapons to Ukraine and start negotiating with Russia. According to Bloomberg, China is helping Russia with dual-use technology like microelectronics, optics, machine tools, propellants for missiles, and nitrocellulose used in the production of gunpowder and explosives. During his visit to China and meeting with Xi, the US Secretary of State Blinken urged China to stop supporting Russia's war in Ukraine, but it is not entirely clear how Washington is going to persuade Beijing to do that. In the meantime, both sides continued to engage in long-range strikes and conduct asymmetric warfare to wear each other down, damage critical assets, and weaken their adversaries' ability to continue fighting. For the past few months, Russia has mostly been targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. According to Ukraine's Prime Minister Shmyhal, Russian missile and drone attacks have destroyed or damaged almost 80% of the production capacity of Ukrainian thermal power plants. Between March 22nd and 29th, Russia targeted 7 thermal power plants and 2 hydropower plants, as Ukraine's struggles with air defense has enabled the Russians to permanently destroy some of the country's critical infrastructure. On April 11th, Russia launched another devastating airborne attack, using more than 80 missiles, including the newest Kh-69 missile and drones, to destroy Kyiv's Trypillia thermal power plant, which supplied energy to Kyiv, Zhytomyr and Cherkasy oblasts. 2 more thermal power plants were also destroyed in West Ukraine as a result of this attack. Another major attack on the Ukrainian power grid was launched on April 26th, which targeted the infrastructure in Dnipropetrovsk, Ivano-Frankivsk and Lviv oblasts. The Ukrainians are already experiencing power shortages, even though the Western allies are trying to alleviate the situation by giving emergency aid to Ukraine. Ukraine's critical infrastructure will continue to be vulnerable to missile and drone strikes until it has more air defense systems and missiles. Also, according to Western governments and media outlets, Russia has been attempting and carrying out various sabotage operations to disrupt production and delivery of military aid to Ukraine. There have been reports of cyber attacks on Czech, Romanian, Latvian, Lithuanian and Estonian railway companies. The Swedish police are investigating 2 earlier cases of railway derailments in the country. Poland has reportedly thwarted an attempt of sabotage on its railways as well. On April 18th, Der Spiegel reported about the arrest of 2 individuals in Bavaria accused of planning sabotage at German military-industrial facilities and American military infrastructure in Germany. On the same day, an explosion occurred at Britain's only 155mm shell-producing plant, 2 days after a fire broke out at the Scranton ammunition plant in the United States. The purpose of these sabotage operations is to disrupt Western military production destined for Ukraine, along with damaging the railway infrastructure, which is key to the supply of military equipment to Kyiv. While Russian long-range strikes mostly target the Ukrainian power grid, Kyiv is focusing on Russian oil refineries, military plants, and other high-value targets like air defense systems and aircraft. Blinken has already publicly stated that the United States does not support Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil refineries. It is tough to understand the long-term impact of these attacks, and whether Russia will be able to quickly restore the lost production capacity. But so far, it is estimated that they have lost some 15% of their oil refining capacity. This has reportedly forced them to purchase gasoline from Kazakhstan and Belarus as a contingency for potential shortages on the domestic market. On April 2nd and 26th, Ukraine attacked an oil refinery in Nizhnekamsk and 2 more oil refineries in Krasnodar Krai. Also on April 2nd, a Ukrainian UJ-22 drone hit the Russian Shahed drone production facility in Yelabuga, Tatarstan. On April 6th, Another drone attack was launched on several airfields, which according to Ukrainian sources, destroyed 6 Russian fighter jets. On April 17th, an ATACMS strike on the Dzhankoy airbase in Crimea reportedly damaged or destroyed Russian air defense infrastructure, including 4 S-400 air defense launchers. On April 18th, the Ukrainians destroyed the first Russian Tu-22M3 strategic bomber in this war. The Ukrainian army now also has ATACMS missiles, and it will be interesting to see how they will be used given the American condition of not launching them on Russian territory. Since the start of 2024, Russia has captured more than 360 square kilometers of Ukrainian land. It is clear that they have the upper hand on the battlefield at this moment, and have already achieved 2 important victories in 2024, in Avdiivka in February and Ocheretina in April, amidst Ukraine's troubles with manpower and weapon shortages. The battles of Chasiv Yar and west of Ocheretina are the ones to watch at the moment, and carry a grave threat to the Ukrainian defense of Donbass. Putin has already admitted that it does not make sense for Russia to negotiate with Ukraine at a time when they carry the strategic momentum on the battlefield. At this point, Ukraine has to brace for defending for at least another few months, before the mobilization and American aid may create a different situation on the battlefield. But make no mistake, Ukraine is facing its most difficult moment since the start of the war. Now let's look at the visually documented losses on both sides compiled by the Oryx military blog. As of May 2nd, Russia has lost at least 2,948 tanks, 6,402 vehicles, 276 command posts and communication stations, 1,202 artillery systems and vehicles, 369 multiple rocket launchers, 109 aircraft, and 137 helicopters. Ukraine has lost at least 797 tanks, 2,517 vehicles, 18 command posts and communication stations, 556 artillery systems and vehicles, 62 multiple rocket launchers, 86 aircraft, and 44 helicopters. We'll continue talking about this war in the coming weeks, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member-exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.